Class is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everybody, and welcome to the monthly OutMatch webinar series. I'm your host, Dan Houts. OutMatch delivers the data that's missing from your hiring process. With clear, measurable insight into candidates and new hires, you will make better hiring decisions, and your organization will finally be able to measure the impact of hiring on your company. Quick housekeeping. If you have questions, you can certainly always use the GoToWebinar queue, or you can tweet to @OutMatchHCM. That's @OutMatchHCM with the hashtag GMs2MUM. We'll address all the questions at the end of the presentation. I'm excited to introduce our presenter today, Carol Jenkins, the Chief Analytics Officer here at OutMatch. Carol's got many years of experience working with Fortune 500 companies in areas like selection assessment, development, process design, leadership, succession planning. So she's an excellent resource for this stuff, this type of topic. Carol is also a licensed industrial organizational psychologist. Without further ado, Carol?
Hi everybody. Thanks, Dan. I'm really excited to be here today and talk to the folks on the call. One thing that Dan didn't mention is my experience in the restaurant industry. I actually was a server at one time, but I have done a lot of work over my past 20 years here with OutMatch, which was formerly Assess Systems, and really worked with a lot of clients that are in the restaurant space as well as the retail space. So when we talk about multi-unit managers, I just wanted to give a little bit of color in terms of my experience, and I think many of you on the phone happen to be either in restaurants or in the retail space. So hopefully I'll try to tailor this presentation a little bit more to that audience. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to walk through just the different points that I'll cover today. Primarily really just kind of setting the stage around the challenges that a multi-unit manager faces, also the importance that that role has on the business. As I talk about multi-units, multi-unit managers, I'm primarily going to be talking about their skill set from a leadership perspective and what aspects of leadership really need to shift and change as they get promoted up the ranks from a general manager to a multi-unit manager. I'm going to talk a little bit about the skill sets that they really need to master at their existing job before they get promoted to a multi-unit manager, and then the competencies and traits of those multi-units, what really leads to success, and potential derailers if they haven't had a chance to really master some of those original skill sets. Then we'll talk a little bit about how you develop these folks, how you get them ready for these roles, how you even identify some of those that are more ready for this level of a job. And then we'll talk a little bit about just internal and external hiring. Now, I like to do a lot of polls within my presentations. And one of the first polls I want to do is really just to know who's on the call today. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that. So if you can go ahead and tell me what your role is, because I think that will help me in terms of guiding the conversation. So are you currently in the role of a multi-unit manager? Are you aspiring to be in one? Do you manage these folks, or do you happen to support or be an HR partner to someone in this role? So we've got most of you completing. I'm going to give it another minute or two, or second or two, and then we're gonna launch it. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close it, and I'm going to share it. All right, so we've got primarily the group on the call today is they support or they are an HR partner with an interest in this role. So that's awesome. I think anybody really in any one of these different areas can benefit, but it is going to be really geared more for the group that we have on the call today, so that is great. Let's go to the next slide and talk about why it's important to really even consider these roles and why they make a huge impact in the business. So In my travels with lots of restaurant companies and retailers, I've visited a lot I've actually done ride-alongs with a lot of multi-units, and I've seen the gamut in terms of what success looks like. Part of what my job has been in the past is to really get to know what are those differentiators between those that are very successful and those that are probably in the middle, and then those that are poor. And it's really interesting as you do these ride-alongs because you can see different types of units and the type of leader you need for each of those units. So, not all multi-units or unit managers are going to be the same. There's absolutely differences between a retail multi-unit, maybe a small box versus a large box, and even a restaurant that's pretty simple versus one that's much more complex. Examples of that might be, I would probably compare more of a fast food, more with like a small box retail, but when you have a restaurant that has like a catering business or different sub-businesses within, that tends to really add a lot more complexity. Or if you have a retail business where you have the complexity of multiple departments, that also creates a level of complexity. The other bit of complexity that these folks are having to manage and really create kind of consistency across the whole organization is the fact that sometimes you have production happening within the unit as well as delivery from a service perspective. So not only is it the standards around what we expect from a service perspective, but really the standards around safety, actual operations, all of that is the role of these multi-unit managers. Now, as the more complex you get, hopefully with the business, the less locations they're having to manage. But there are places that millions of dollars coming through the doors. So it's a huge role. As you can see in the background, these multi-unit managers have hundreds of GMs reporting into them, and it is a very intense role that you have to be really careful in terms of who you place. So just wanted to call that out. Now the challenges are even, I think, more interesting because you have, you could potentially have a really great manager, and we'll talk about this throughout the presentation, that when they get in this role, it becomes really problematic. You need to have those leaders that are comfortable with things not being under their control. In a unit, once they're outside those four walls, it becomes a lot more of a sense of ambiguity that they're having to deal with, and they're really going to have to master their leadership skills to drive results through others. So kind of the key challenges are, the scope is greater, they're having to coach from afar, they're really having to manage their time, so they're spending the right amount of time with the right people. And in some cases, the personalities that are leading the units are really going to need different types of leadership styles. They also need to, the other master that they have to work with is the corporation, is the corporate office, and really being able to fill that gap between headquarters and the field is critical. And so they are really faced with a job of making sure consistency is happening. The brand image is being, done in a very effective way. They're having to be an amazing leader to all these different personalities and styles. And then they're having to work with their boss and the corporate office, really asking them to do different things, whether it's driving a new initiative or just really reporting back data upwards. So a huge challenge, very different than what you typically see within the unit. So let's do another poll. I just want to see where you all really find that there's a challenge within your business. So let's talk through this. So where do you think is your biggest challenge? So things are more out of control, especially for someone, and I'm thinking about it more from them moving into this role. Where do they find it to be the biggest challenge? Things are out of control, the scope is greater, getting results through others, coaching from afar, the gap between corporate and headquarters, go ahead and let you all answer through that. All right, we're getting a lot of interesting results here. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close it and share it. Okay, so two of them are really at the top here. So things being more out of control. So, and I 100% agree with that. That was why it was first on my list, because it is a total mindset shift, and then getting results through others. These other things are also probably as a result of that important as well. So being able to coach from afar, and just being kind of that in-between person between headquarters. All right, so let's go to the next slide here and talk about why it's important when we have these transitions that we really need to be careful about who we put in this role and how we really get them up to speed quickly, and really support them. So what we find in our work is that leadership transitions are somewhat risky, and there is a fairly high percentage of them that will fail, about 40% of them. And when you ask the question about why, there's actually some process reasons, right? So, somebody didn't learn how to manage that transition, or maybe the organization didn't manage it in a good way. Sometimes the case is that they didn't put the right person in the job, right? So what we'll talk about a little bit later today is when we really think about identifying high potentials, it's not always that best GM or the best manager in the store that's going to be your best multi-unit. They're very different competencies that you need at the next level. It could be that this person now, who was in a really well-supported community, is now having to stretch themselves more geographically. So not only is it a big stretch from what they're doing, but also from their support system. So making sure that this person is very good at getting the resources they need, getting their answers that they need, because once they're outside those four walls, it becomes more and more critical that they're going to be stretched thinner, and they're going to really need to figure out how to get things done or get resources that they might need. Another reason for failure that you tend to see in these types of roles is just lack of clarity around expectations. Knowing that the job is completely shifting, that you're no longer the doer in the store, that you're now kind of looking at it from a different lens. And then that last one there, which we've talked about, which is radically different success factors for this new role. Now, I'm sure many of you have seen a chart like this, which really talks about just the leadership transitions that you see at different levels. I thought it would be important to talk about this because not only is the job a shift for that leader in terms of what they're doing day to day, but the actual leadership skills they're going to need are very different. When we look at the leadership pipeline, and this book is quoted there right below, this isn't all the levels that the book talks about, but I figured these would be really good to talk about, and specifically focusing in with the GM and the multi-unit. So the key premise around these leadership transitions is that each career passage or each level has each unique characters, challenges, and each have a different skill set that you have to be able to be effective at to succeed. And as you progress to the next level up, you have to have success in your level that you are currently in. If you haven't mastered that skill set, then you'll end up even getting into more trouble as you go up to the next level. So let's talk through this a little bit. So typical struggles that we see for a GM that just got promoted to a multi-unit are these things, especially if they haven't figured this out at the GM level. So they need to be able to build strong teams and manage turnover. So think about if they're not in that store every day and they don't have that strong team and their team is turning over, that becomes even more critical. So if they haven't figured out how to really do that well in their previous job, that's going to be a big miss for them. Communication and translating the vision now becomes less and less frequent because they're not in those restaurants or in those stores as often as if they were working there. And so being intentional on how you communicate, and making sure you're communicating the right things in the right way becomes even more important. The delegation and the trusting others to do the work, probably one of the most critical pieces at this level. As a manager, they have to be able to do this. So if they haven't, when they move up a level, this becomes detrimental. They physically cannot do the work of 6 locations if they can't delegate and trust others. So it is a huge failure spot for many of those multi-units if they haven't mastered this. Knowing where the resources are and how to deploy them effectively. The next bullet, which is around adjusting your leadership style, that could mean allowing your managers to handle their problems and manage their teams on their own, so giving them a lot of freedom. Letting go goes hand in hand with that, and allowing them to make mistakes. So it's important that they shift themselves into more of a coaching and a mentoring role rather than that doer role. So really help. And then transparency and being able to hold others accountable and make those tough calls when they have to. So those are all kind of typical struggles that they see if they have not previously been able to manage that in the past. So let's talk about where your multi-units managers tend to struggle. And again, I'm going to show this question in 2 ways, because right now we're really only talking about the areas of the current level that they were in, about to be promoted to a multi-unit manager. In a minute, I'll show you some struggles that you see once they're in that multi-unit manager role. So which ones would you pick? And this, you can pick more than one. Do they deploy resources, flex their leadership style, and then show transparency? So which ones of those, you can pick as many as you want, do you tend to see people struggling? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll here. All right. So I don't know if I biased everybody when I said that delegating and trusting others was like very important, but it is. So hopefully you all agreed with me, even if I said that ahead of time. But 83% of you felt like that was kind of a key area where you typically see that struggle. And then we've got 50% in just building those strong teams. I mean, it is detrimental to have to replace people all the time, so that's a critical piece. And the final 3 were about 33%. Okay, well now let's talk about the new skill set. So as they move into the multi-unit manager role, these are the new things at this next leadership level that are really critical. So number 1 is really analyzing the business and looking for patterns rather than just reacting. So it's really thinking about, what is the data telling me, and what am I learning across my units? And what are the things that I can do to really make a difference when I need to within a particular unit? And how do I manage my team to understand the data so that they can make better decisions? So one is that analyzing the data, looking for those patterns. The second one is really uncovering those solutions that can impact multiple things. So really kind of thinking at it, it kind of goes hand in hand with the third bullet, really looking at the data, looking at the trends that they're seeing at multiple places that you're trying to implement a similar process. What are those things that I'm seeing that really benefited one location that I can now apply to another location? So it's a little bit more of that strategic sense of understanding data and knowing what the impact of making a shift will have to your actual business. The other critical skill set, and I've mentioned this a little bit, is around time management. Being in a really geographically diverse or dispersed area can be very wearing on that individual. So depending on how close the restaurants are, how close the stores are, it can become a big challenge. And if you have someone that is not necessarily super strong in terms of organization skills, or even really work pace and just having kind of that sense of urgency, and detail orientation, you tend to struggle a little bit in keeping all the balls in the air and figuring out who you're going to see when and what makes the most sense at the right time. So should I spend my time with this GM because of this critical issue? Do I need to reschedule and go see someone else? How often do I go see them? The other critical skill set here is really being able to influence without that direct authority, without being there, making sure they're doing it. So that's part of the trust and that relationship building, so that they are doing the right thing when you're not there. And a lot of times what happens is if you have a very directive lead that was a really good GM because they were there kind of constantly answering and solving problems for their people, if you don't learn to build that skill set at this level for your GMs, then they're not going to do the right things. They're not going to be able to make the right decisions. They have to have the skill set on their own. So being an overly directive leader, where you like to solve things every time someone calls, ends up kind of handicapping that general manager in the future when you're not available. So it's really about how you build the relationships, how you communicate as well, and how you make sure you kind of teach them how to fish versus fishing for them. Another critical one that people don't think about is the ability to collaborate with their peers as well as with corporate. So, you know, if you have a very ambitious, assertive GM that was pretty much running the show, once they get to this next level, they are not necessarily, they're running the show for their units, but they're having to play nice with people at corporate because they're having to interface with them a lot more, and their peers. So it's really important that that collaboration of best practices and of you know, influencing without that direct authority, that they're able to master that so they can be most effective and get the resources they need for their locations, because they can't do it based on authority. They don't have authority usually over corporate or even their peers. And then finally, the last one here is bubbling up strategy and trends to the broader organization. So I think that's an added value. If you can do all the other things, that's great. The last one is where you get seen as being that next candidate for the next level up, because you're really identifying strategies, you're really coming up with strategies that maybe at the level of a multi-unit manager you're not able to implement on your own, but if you're able to showcase those to the boss above them and have something implemented across the organization because of that, that's a huge plus. So definitely a value add. Okay, let's do another poll. Now let's look at the different skills that I just mentioned, which were the multi-unit ones, and how that skill set has changed for once you're at that level. Where do you guys see, and I'll launch it right now, the skill set being the most difficult? So is it the ability to analyze the data at this broader level? Is it finding patterns of why things happen? Is it understanding reporting and knowing what that means? Is it the time management? Or is it the influence without the direct authority? So go ahead and put your votes in, and we'll leave this open for a few more seconds. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close it. I think we have most of you in here already. And let's go ahead and share it. So this is interesting. You know, the initial, as the polls were coming in, the last one, their influence was the highest. So it looks like it shifted a little bit by the time we got most people in. But what you see here is really the analyzing things at this broader level and not being reactive and kind of being a little bit more of a thinker. So I think that's where most of you are saying is the hardest part, as well as the time management. So that's good. That's really interesting. Okay, so I'm sure you've read the book. What got you here won't get you there, right? From Marshall Goldsmith. Essentially, what this says is that the competencies you needed at that general manager role are not necessarily what makes you most effective at the next level. And really, the most effective moms are not the super GMs. So it takes more. We've talked a little bit about those skill sets, but it definitely is a shift in mindset and a shift in what you do every day on the job. So typical GMs, what you generally see in terms of the work we do from an assessment perspective is there's definitely a profile around it. Typical GMs are organized or detailed. They tend to multitask. They tend to be fairly logic. They work the plan. They like structure. That is something that we've seen for both retail and restaurant is general managers tend to be very structured. And they also tend to be highly social. So they are also high work pace, but so are the multi-units, right? So, but the key thing, it's more about like executing a plan. And if the plan is built for them and they're following it, they tend to be more effective. That is what we generally see in the majority of our applicants applying for general manager roles. What's interesting is when you go to the next level up, where you have someone that lives outside of the box, they are not confined to one restaurant and they're all over the place. Those people tend to prefer freedom. The ones that tend to make it to that level, whether it's chicken or the egg, whether they make it there because they are this work style, or because those that have that style tend to prefer that type of job. It's hard to say which is which. But they tend to prefer freedom, which is very different than that preferring of structure. They also tend to be a little bit more big picture in the thinking style. They tend to be more independent in the way they make decisions, a little bit more serious, right? And there's some downsides about being this more serious, deliberate person because, remember, one of the critical skill sets for people in this role is they have to be able to, be social enough where they're building relationships. So even though they tend to be a little bit more serious, kind of not necessarily as open and genuine and as expressive as a general manager, but much more professional and serious, that might be a difficult area for them in terms of how they work with others and build relationships. They also need to handle criticism. Those are kind of the key things. Now, it's not saying that the other roles don't have that, but those are some of the differentiators that we see. In terms of the actual multi-unit manager competencies, what we found is there's some critical ones. So the whole problem analysis and understanding data. So that with business acumen are really, really critical. So do they understand the business? Do they understand the data? Are they able to solve problems on their own and make good decisions around it? Championing change, that's a critical one as well. So it's not so much about vision and having a strategy for their particular area, because that usually gets sent down to them from corporate or from their boss. It's more about how do I champion an initiative and I'm selling it to my team and getting them all behind it. Critical ones that are kind of table stakes, planning and organizing, driving results, being able to manage, to handle customers and handle that, create a culture where customer focus is critical. Managing the team, these are all kind of table stakes as well. Coaching and developing others. Building relationships becomes really important here because that is that peer-to-peer relationship as well as relationship with corporate. So that becomes critical. And then interpersonal communication, which we talked about earlier in terms of being very intentional, knowing what to tell the team. It's not everything. You have to be a filter in certain cases. But really being able to communicate succinctly in a non-confusing way so that you get buy-in and you get a lot of people following specifically how you need them to. From an assessment standpoint, as probably many of you know, we work with a lot of restaurant clients and retail clients. So we've built some profiles for different levels of people. So for a general manager, what you'll see on the right there, some of the things that are shaded are what success generally looks like for that role. If you haven't seen our assessments, we generally measure how people think, work, and relate. And those boxes represent like a 0 to 100% range. So the dots are where, the dots is just somebody's score. So you can ignore that in this example. But what you see on the right is there's less thinking skills that tend to be as important for a GM than when you get to the multi-unit manager level. It's not to say that they're not important today for a general manager, but in terms of across companies, when we looked at the data, the real differentiators for thinking happen more at the multi-unit level. You can see things like work pace across the board for leaders in these roles. It's important for both of them. Multi-unit managers need to be a little bit more self-reliant. They need to, another kind of key one is they tend to be a little bit more higher on that self-control scale as well. So they tend to be a little bit more serious, a little bit more careful. This kind of also plays into that political savvy piece of it, but that tends to be important as well. Okay, so let's talk about some major derailers and fatal flaws. So you can say pretty much the opposite of every skill that I showed earlier, but just to kind of put it based on just what we've seen, you know, the poor follow-through becomes really bad if you're having to do the multiple visits, having that huge scope of responsibility. If you're not buttoned up in terms of, you know, you hold somebody accountable, you tell them, hey, this is what I'd like to see next time, or we've agreed on this thing that we want to see changed, and if you're not going back and following up, those things tend to slip. So it's really critical that you're closing that loop and making sure things are happening based on your expectations that you've communicated initially. The sense of urgency. So making sure that, you know, everyone knows you're working super hard in this role, and that your level and expectation of when things need to happen has to be fairly high. One of the things that's kind of interesting from a fatal flaw perspective is focusing so much on compliance, especially on audits. Again, this is almost like what I was talking about, a very directive manager, multi-unit manager. They're going to come in with their checklist, and they're going to show me everything I did wrong. And they're going to give me a list, and they're going to tell me this needs to fix, this needs to be fixed, etc. To me, that's a very, you know, not that you shouldn't do that, but I almost would give the clipboard to the manager, and I would say, I want you to go through the process, and I want you to tell me what you see is wrong. And let's talk about it. And if you miss something, yeah, I'll show you, and I'll teach you. So it's not so much I'm this, you know, coming in with my white glove, and I'm telling you and creating that, like, fear component with your leaders, but instead you're working side by side with them, showing them, you know, here's how this restaurant or this store, this is the expectation of what it needs to look like. I want you to be able to spot these when I'm not here and be able to fix them. So that's a huge component if they just focus on audits and checklists, that they're going to miss really educating and teaching their leaders how to do that when they're not around. Losing sight of the big picture, over control, micromanagement, right? You can't micromanage 6 locations at the same time. It's just not physically possible. The poor balance of thought and action, we talked about that, right? So if they're overly reactive, they're not really thinking things through. The retaining of stars, it is so critical at this point to have people they can trust that are fantastic working for them. The results they get are just tremendous. So in order to retain people, a lot of what needs to happen is the coaching, the training, the developing, the building the relationships. And when there is a poor performer, having the courage to get them out as quickly as possible. So failing to build strong teams and holding people accountable really go hand in hand with that last one. So we're going to talk a little bit about just the experiences that GMs will need before they get to this multi-unit manager role. And as we think about building those competencies, you know, there's different types of ways you can develop people. You know, one is around just kind of skill building, right? So here's kind of the mechanics of how restaurants are run or how stores are run. Here are the mechanics of how do you read data. That's more the skill building. The wisdom assignment is when you go beyond that, right? So you go beyond just really understanding the mechanics, but now I've actually applied it in different ways, and I can adjust myself based on that. So I've created a lot of wisdom around what I've learned. And then finally, the critical learning experiences. Those are great experiences that really can help develop you in multiple ways, develop this multi-unit manager. One is, you know, being able, when faced with very difficult situations, if they've built on that experience, they can then apply that knowledge to the new situation. So let's talk through some of these. So in terms of preparing the GM for that transition, one of the critical things to do is really shadow a multi-unit leader so that they can understand what they're getting into. So having them do ride-alongs, especially with someone who's good, right? You don't want them to shadow a poor multi-unit manager, but really understanding what that job is and what it looks like. Work with a mentor or a coach on improving as a leader. So really kind of taking their management and their coaching skills up a level by working with a really good leader. Focusing on the communication aspect, okay? Seeking feedback from others. So a 360 is a great way to give them additional insight into their skill set and into their leadership capabilities. And then finally, I think another critical piece for GMs to move into the next role is understanding more kind of outside the organization. What are best practices that other people in other restaurants or other retail organizations, what do they do? And a lot of that will require them to join like an industry group or attend networking functions to really build some key people in the network that they can lean on when they have to make critical decisions. And also to kind of give them an external perspective to their role. The next one here, which is really when you are thinking about experiences now, these are not necessarily, they're skill building, but they're also kind of if you remember the tree, they're the higher level of the tree, right? So having them participate on a strategic team on behalf of another multi-unit leader. So getting them exposed to the corporate people, right? So who are the players on the corporate side and who are the peers in the multi-unit ranks. So really participating on it from a strategic perspective, but also for visibility and really getting a realistic feel for what it will be like working in that role. Having them think about their own business and thinking about a long-term strategic plan. So maybe it is looking at data, and if you're a multi-unit manager leading a GM and preparing them for this role, you're having them think about, maybe you bring in data from another restaurant and you say, tell me what should be the strategic plan? What should we change for this restaurant? Here's where they're struggling. What are some key things that we could do differently? Another key one, if there is a leadership workshop that you all put on at corporate, have them attend that, and if there's an action learning team or a project where they're actually solving a real business problem and having to present to the leaders of the business, is an amazing process for them. One, they start thinking about it more as their business versus their just little unit that they're working, but this is a broader business and how my decisions might impact other units or other areas. It also allows them to get, again, visibility to that leadership team and presentation skills and things like that. So that's another critical experience that you can provide for a GM who's looking to move into this role. Another one that's really good is working in either a very challenging market or having to turn around their restaurant, so maybe moving them to a location that's suffering and seeing if they're able to turn that around. That's a huge stretch for a manager, but it really allows them that experience that they'll probably face as a multi-unit manager. Building a team from scratch. And then the last one there is a really critical one, which is it's really testing their championing change skills, and that would be rolling out some kind of new initiative or process to the field. So making sure they've had the experiences are super critical. Okay, so let's go to succession planning. And before we do this graph here, I do want to do a poll and ask you all how you all identify your high potentials. And you can check as many as you want here, but if there's one that you do alone, just check that one. So the three are ask managers for their input, determine potential and assessment of new competencies, and then base it on their current performance. Okay, it looks like we've got most everybody, so I'm going to close this. And I'm going to share it. So what's interesting is 100% of you base it on their current job performance. And then 60% ask for manager input. So the good news is that's pretty typical of what we see. The bad news is that generally looking at potential is not usually indicative of performance in their current job. So let's kind of walk through how we look at succession planning and potentially give you some ideas of what you should consider when you start doing this for your GMs as you want them to move to the next level. So what you see here is probably a very familiar 9-box chart, which I'm sure most of you are using. And what's on the bottom is performance. So performance absolutely needs to be an indicator of future success. But what happens a lot of times when we work with organizations is that their focus is so much on performance, and potential is like missing from the equation. And so a couple things to think about is, from a performance standpoint, yes, they really should be, and really most of the time you don't consider somebody to move into the next role unless they're in these top boxes here. So that means they're at least middle to high performers, whether it's meeting expectations or exceeding, but the potential is high as well. So when we talk about potential, I think there's 2 places you really need to think about. One is, personally, does that person want to take on this new role? If you think about a multi-unit manager, the role is a lot more stressful from a disruption to their work-life balance. It generally is going to require a lot more travel. It's a lot more stress. The scope is huge. The level of exposure is higher. So knowing what's involved and kind of the risks of potential failures should be considered in terms of their ability to want to take on that role. The other piece that when I asked in my poll was, determining potential with a assessment on those new competencies. Whether you use an assessment or you're somehow trying to determine, can they do these new competencies, even if it's asking managers, you should ask it in a form of the future competencies. So if it's about championing change, or if it's about thinking strategically, things that they may not have had to do as a GM. They probably do a lot of championing changes as GM, but at a different level. So kind of defining the competencies needed at a multi-unit manager level and how they're different from a general manager, and then asking managers to give insight onto that. Now, manager input, the problem is they tend to mix performance with potential. But if you can define specifically, I need to know if this person is the type of leader that can be, really adjusting to multiple leadership types, is more of a developer of people and a coach, kind of teaching how to fish versus a doer. Those are the things, those are the competencies, and what I listed was not competencies but more skills. Those are the things that should be considered as you think about who is ready for this next role. We'll use assessments that tap into those new skill sets that potentially people haven't seen them display on the job. So even like a 360 is not a good tool for potential, because a lot of that skill set that you're asking people to do differently for the future job has never been observed in their current job. So skill, projects or special assignments that get them exposed to displaying these new competencies are definitely indicators of how you can test the potential side. Or again, giving assessments that help you tap into that is a useful component to understanding potential. The last thing that you really want to do in this case is to promote somebody that's an incredible GM or multi-unit manager, or a GM or a store manager, and then they fail because they're not effective at those future roles or the future competencies. All right, so the great thing would be is you've got a pool of these multi-unit managers that are just sitting there waiting to be promoted, that are going to be super successful. Unfortunately, in many organizations, either the teams are not exposed or don't know who's going to be really good, so they tend to struggle in placing people into these multi-unit manager roles. And again, they're so important, and the failure rate is fairly high, that there's definitely a risk. So doing calibration around the succession planning and really getting a lot of input in terms of that potential piece is huge to help you fill it with internal candidates. However, if you don't have that option, whether you don't feel people are ready, it's not a bad thing to go external as well. You know, when you go external, what you find is it's important to do so because you don't have a ready base of people sitting on the bench ready to move into this role. Another benefit of externals is that they can inject a good bit of fresh ideas and new skill sets in the company. So especially a company that's trying to innovate, maybe trying to keep up with competitors, they may want to bring in some people that have success in a competitor environment so that they can bring some of those fresh ideas. You also can look external to your industry. So I think that retail, banking, restaurants, those are similar multi-unit situations where you can leverage people across those. Again, I would think about and consider the complexity discussion that I had earlier. It would probably be very difficult to put someone that comes from a small box retailer and throw them into a multi-unit restaurant, so a restaurant that has catering, a great bar business, then a restaurant business, or different components. Like that creates a lot more complexity. So try to find people with similar skill sets in different industries, but that have some similarities with the types of units that you have. What you see on the right is it's really dependent on the organization, and again, it's ideal if you can bring people from within, but there's absolutely some benefits from an external standpoint. So let's just ask, what percentage of your moms are external? So go ahead and let me launch it. How many would you say within your hires, let's take the last year, actually came from external versus the internal? All right, let's go ahead and close it. So pretty interesting. I would have expected, pretty similar results to what we see here. So the majority being less than 25%. I probably actually would have expected that middle category, the 26 to 50%. Generally here about a 40-60 is the percentage. So it looks like kind of a split there. A few of you said you didn't know. So again, really thinking about how you can ready the bench, especially if you all are HR folks and you're working in, in helping your business partners with these decisions. Absolutely do the 9-box exercise and really think about, what performance and potential differentiators are, especially for that future competency. So just wanted to talk a little bit about just summarizing this and then maybe take some questions. So in summary, multi-unit roles are extremely important. I think all of you know that. That's probably why you're on the call. That transition can be very difficult. Many fail. And then, really paying attention to the skill sets and those leadership passages that people have to go through and being able to develop towards that and really thinking about that, thinking about them from a potential standpoint, but also development. And then finally, not to, be afraid to hire those externals. So I want to open it up for questions. Let me go ahead and switch the slide here. And I know I got one, and I don't know if I know the answer to this, but if someone on the line knows and they want to chat it in, that would be great because that would help this person here. They mentioned that they asked the question, you mentioned turnover for GMs and multi-units is about 40%. So what I was talking about there was not turnover. I would say turnover for GMs from an industry standpoint with restaurants, that number I know pretty well, tends to be about 33% for general managers. It could be different for you all. Multi-unit managers tend to be lower. I'm going to guess around 25%. The 40% number that I was showing was just when you have managers or leaders transition into roles, that transition fail rate tends to be about 40%. So that's, hopefully that metric is helpful. I didn't want to confuse on that. In terms of, the question that they asked is, do you know what percentage of external hires don't succeed? I would open that up to the audience to see if anybody wants to chat in a response to that. I think, my response to that would be it really depends on your culture. And if your culture is one that really encourages the internal hire and really communicates the value of promotion because people understand your systems, they understand your business, it's going to be, I think, a challenge to have new people get adopted in. So it's not that they fail because they can't do the job. I mean, I'm sure in some cases that's the case, but it might be more about just kind of onboarding and difficulty getting in. You can also potentially see that if your culture is a very results or very heavy feedback culture where people are really direct and they tell you when you do a bad job right to your face, that culture may not work for somebody from an external different culture, right? So they can come from a, maybe retail would have more of that reputation than restaurants, where people tend to be a little bit more nicer in the hospitality side of things. So I'm making assumptions there, but I would say that absolutely, culture probably plays the biggest role in terms of your internals and your external hires being successful, and really understanding your culture. And if you need to change that, because I do think that you can probably gauge what the culture looks like, and if you're going to have, look at the past, see how many people have succeeded not because of their performance, but because they were a bad culture fit. And if you want to shift that and have a more openness culture to externals, it really starts throughout the organization. It can't start with just that new hire coming in. Dan, I don't know if you've gotten any questions on your end. I don't see any more chat questions coming in.
What's interesting, a couple of questions came through on the Twitter machine, and you answered them throughout the webinar.
Oh, good.
You went through competencies and all that stuff. So hopefully the questions were answered to those people throughout the webinar, and they were listening. So I don't have any more. That last one was it.
Okay, well, good. Well, one other little kind of tiny thing that I would say, if we do have a lot of folks that are restaurant or retailers on the phone, we do an industry reporting for our clients that looks at things in their selection process, like what the typical diversity looks like of their applicants and what the drop-off rate of candidates within our assessment process or their screen out rates. If you all are if anybody's interested in some of that data, just either chat or send Dan an email. Dan, I don't know if you've got, let me look and see what we have here on the next slide. We do have our webinar information for the next one is July 14th, but if you want to email Dan at info@outmatch.com, specifically ask for some of that restaurant trend data or retail trend data. We do have it for last quarter, which would have been January, beginning of the year this year, both at the management and the hourly level. I don't believe we have multi-units in there, but we definitely have management level, more at the GM, assistant manager level, and then we have hourly data too. So we'd be more than happy to kind of have a discussion with you about that data. And just kind of show you some interesting things that we've seen across our clients in this space.
Wonderful. Well, so that's it for the webinar today. So thank you very much for attending. Like Carol said, our next webinar will be July 14th, and we'll be sending out more information about that shortly. You can get us at info@outmatch.com. You can always tweet us at OutMatchHCM. and get us on our website at outmatch.com. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Bye, everyone. Thanks for your participation.